Hello, this is the first video I'll be making in a series of videos that I'll be planning to make alongside my own self-study for AWS certificate. Specifically, the certificate is for the AWS Certified Developer Associate certificate. And essentially what this is going to be is I'm going to go through while I'm studying AWS and um, going through all the various services that AWS provides and essentially make maybe not necessarily super in depth, but just some of the things I'm learning or picking up here and there as I'm going through. Um, Today's video is going to be pretty short and simple. It's going to be on the IAM feature of AWS, which is essentially what you need to get started. So I think it's appropriate for a first video. So IAM stands for Identity and Account Management. Um, and essentially, the way that IAM structured is that for AWS console, we have what's called a root user, which is essentially like similar to a terminal on your computer, a root account that has basically complete omniscient privileges and permissions, right? And essentially, what we would consider the best practice in general is that we would have a root user, but generally the root user account is not being used. Instead, the root user account is just initially created, and within that root user account, we can create multiple user accounts for actual physical people to use. So a general guideline or good practice to follow is that for each physical user of your AWS console, or for each physical user that you have, if you're a team of developers or a team of people, that singular physical user should have one AWS user, and the root user is what is used to create those user accounts. But generally speaking, this root user is only used for those kinds of operations and not much else. So if I go to IAM here to manage access to AWS resources, here's where we can start, creating users and the such. So for example, if I wanted to so currently actually I'm logged into a root account, and if I want to create an IAM user, I would just go ahead and create a user, give it some sort of username. Let's just say user1. And then we have the ability to attach set permissions for a user, right? And this can be done in a variety of different ways, right? One common one of which is adding user to a user group. So we're gonna try and add the user to a user group. And for that we would need to create one, right? So for example, let's begin by creating an administrator group, and we give it the policy of administrator access. Pretty common. So we create this group, and now we can assign this user to this administrator group with the attached policy of administrator access. And like that, we're creating our new user with the permission group administrator. So I'll go into this a little bit later what this actually is doing. Now, one thing you can also optionally add is tags. Maybe one example of it would just be like you would put team and then just say like dev team A, maybe something like this. It's just an optional place to add a tag if you want to add a tag. So now we create our first user along with our first user group, the administrator user group, and simple as that. And generally speaking, so with that, I would like to get into sort of what the idea behind this kind of user group or these permissions kind of entails, right? So we like this when we create a user group, essentially what a group is essentially is a list of policies, right, or permissions that the group that users in that group inherit from being in that group. So For example, I can attach additional policies to this administrator group. Not only that, maybe there's some. I can attach various policies as a group, and these policies are all detail some sort of access to some service on AWS, right? So when I've configured this group to have certain policies or permissions, any user that's in that group will inherit those policies. So, and additionally, right, for each given user, they can either be in a group, or they can be in no group, or they can be in multiple groups. So let's say general, let's just name this group general user group. And we can add our first user that we created here to this group and give some sort of, we can give it maybe like EC2 full access. We can maybe give it something like S3 full access, something like this, right? As policies. Oops, sorry. General user group. Give these kinds of access. And now we have two user groups and one user that's in two of these groups. And because of that, this user now inherits all the attached policies from the user groups that they're a member of. So pretty simple to understand. With that, additionally, something that each user needs to do eventually is, now that I have a user of AWS, let me sign out again, sign in the console. Leave is oops. Let me right. Sorry about that. Now that we have a user, right? The next natural question is how do we have this user sign in, or how does this user access AWS, right? And generally speaking, right, there are three ways for an IAM user to access AWS services, right? There's three vectors, right? Either through a console, right? Either through the command line interface, or also or programmatically through the SDK, right? And the last two that I mentioned, they would require an access key, right? So let's first enable console access by creating a password, generating a password for this new user. In this case, we have a console sign-in URL. We should be able to simplify this URL through, I believe, in our dashboard, right? There we go. If we go to our dashboard, now we should be able to simplify the sign-in URL for IAM users by going to our dashboard and setting an account alias. So right now it's just a jumble of numbers is actually our account ID, but if we change this to something simpler to remember, this one might already have existed. I guess it's not existed. we can now have a more simplified URL for this IAM user. So what I'm going to do is, well, I can't really do that. What I'm going to do is turn on multi-session support and add a session here for this account ID or alias. So now we can do self-study. Username is user1, and the password is that custom password I said earlier. Now we're signed in as this IAM user. And now we can access the console and whatever services we have access to given by this root user to this IAM user. So you can see that some things we don't even have access to view because the root user, as a root user, we haven't given access to view some of this stuff. However, one thing that we should be able to view as this IAM user is our own access keys. So if I go to my own account settings, sorry, not account settings. If I go to my security credentials, this is where we can add some access keys, right? And this is sort of what we can use to access the command line interface, SDK, and those kinds of things, right? So I'm going to go ahead and create one for the command line interface. CLI key. And here is where I would make sure to not share the secret access key at least, but I will definitely make sure to store the access key and the secret access key somewhere where I can save it and access it later for this user. You can also download a CSV, right, for this user. And now we can use this access key to access the AWS command line interface. Yeah, so I think that's a good overview of IAM and creating a user, adding users to groups, setting policies for groups, and sort of just generally how the policy inheritance works, right? As a user, you can be in 0 or more groups, and when you are a member of a group, you inherit all the policies that group has permissions for. So as a user, I can inherit the policies from, in this instance, I can inherit the policies from the administrator group and the general user group because this user, user1 is in both of these groups. Additionally, actually, before I end off, one more thing to mention is the idea of roles, right? Like maybe if I go back to the ID, right? Roles are essentially a feature of IAM where suppose we have an AWS service that needs to perform actions as if they were, accessing the AWS console. For example, an EC2 instance or a Lambda function needs to access AWS console or perform actions using AWS services, and we want that, that instance or that service to be as if they had certain permissions, right? This is where we assign certain IAM roles to those services. So that's another feature. Generally wrapping up, for best practices, like I said at the beginning, for this root account, generally if you're working in a group of AWS developers, you create the root account, but nobody's really using it. It's more often the case that each physical person has their own AWS user, right? And additionally, we should make use of this group feature to make permissions assignment more simplified to users. And of course, on a more basic level, we want our passwords for these accounts to be strong. And additionally, generally speaking, we should use and enforce the use of MFA or multi-factor authentication, where not only you need to have the knowledge of an account's password, but also physical verification of identity, whether it's through a phone or a security key. And yeah, I think that wraps it up for here. Thank you for watching.